What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today. We are officially over halfway through the season, which is just wild to say. It takes so long to get here every single year, and then week 0 arrives, and now, in the blink of an eye, we're already done with week 8. But it's been a fun ride so far. Week 8 was an interesting one for a couple of reasons. We're going to be breaking down everything from this past weekend and talking about the implications of some of the major games, as well as highlighting some of the best performances of the week. So make sure to stick around to the end for that. All right, let's get right into it. Number 5 Georgia took down number 1 Texas 30-15 in a pretty strange game in Austin. This was the second time that the AP number 1 team has lost in the last 3 weeks. And we now have our 4th different team at number 1 so far this year, with the Oregon Ducks taking over that top spot. This Georgia-Texas game was super ugly for the first half, and got even uglier in the second half in some respects. But it was just really not what I was expecting at all from these two teams. Coming into Saturday, we'd had 2 other top 5 matchups, and they were both insane. 1-possession games down to the final play, really final minute, and in the Georgia-Alabama and Ohio State-Oregon games. But this one just felt a little bit different. Carson Beck started the game 5 of 10 for 40 yards and 2 interceptions. Texas ended up putting Arch Manning in for a little bit because Ewers had a pretty rough start too. Georgia jumped out to a 23-0 lead at the half, and the game really just never felt all that suspenseful. It did get somewhat interesting during the controversial call and the subsequent events in that second half, but even when it was 23-15, it really felt like a Georgia-controlled game for the vast majority of it. I did want to touch on the officiating situation in the second half. If you missed it, there was a critical defensive pass interference call where Texas picked off Carson Beck for a 3rd time and then took the ball all the way down to the 10-yard line. And that was, I think it was 23-7 at that point. So Texas was really trying to get back into the game. This was like one of their big chances to do so. But that interception was initially called back due to defensive pass interference. And it was a pretty bad call. The Texas fans responded just by littering one of the end zones with garbage. The game was paused for like 5 minutes when they eventually went out there to get everything cleaned up. And then for some reason, after all that, the officials got together and said, actually, there was no pass interference. The interception stands. And then that led to Kirby Smart understandably being irate and then accused the officials of trying to rob them after the game. But the biggest thing about that play, which ended up not even really having an effect on the game since Texas still lost by 15 anyway, but the biggest takeaway there is the precedent that it sets for other teams in other games the rest of the year, and specifically the fan bases involved in those games. Because if there's a call that's controversial in a big-time matchup moving forward, or really even in just a close game where it could have a major impact, well, the fans of that affected team within throwing range of the field are probably going to try their luck at getting it overturned like Texas did. So that set up a lot of potential problems for games down the road. I mentioned it pretty thoroughly in the Week 8 preview episode, but before Saturday's game, Texas hadn't faced an opponent with an offense in the top 70. And they'd faced Colorado State, Michigan, UTSA, UL Monroe, Mississippi State, and Oklahoma. So with the way that Michigan and Oklahoma have kind of crumbled this season and both really just cannot score the ball whatsoever, there's an actual case to be made for Texas's best win right now being over 5-1 UL Monroe. Michigan's passing offense is currently ranked 129th in the FBS. They were beaten by 14 by Illinois. They lucked out against Minnesota. They were, obviously dominated by Texas. They lost by double digits to Washington, who has 3 losses. I mean, without the wins over Minnesota, which they got because Minnesota's onside kick recovery was called back, so Minnesota didn't even have that last chance that they probably should have had. Then Fresno State was a close game for Michigan too. I mean, there is a world where if things don't go their way against Minnesota and Fresno State, and even the last play of the game against USC, or one of the last plays of their drive, which was a 4th down touchdown, I mean, Michigan could be a 1-5 team. Oklahoma cannot score. They were just destroyed by South Carolina. These teams are just simply not good. And there is an actual argument that UL Monroe is Texas's best win right now. The early schedule really didn't do Texas any favors, and that was pretty evident in Austin on Saturday. And I talked about the difference in level of competition for Georgia, having faced Clemson, having faced Alabama, who is kind of underwhelming so far the past couple weeks, but they at least have the talent that some of Michigan and Oklahoma and Mississippi State obviously don't. And that difference in competition for Georgia really showed on Saturday night when they got out to a 23-0 lead at halftime. So Georgia's reestablished themselves as the top dog in the SEC again, at least for now. They have since moved back up to number 2 in the AP poll, and they're staying alive in the SEC race. For Texas, this game was pretty surprising, and as much as I get on Texas's schedule and them facing 6 teams who struggle to score for the first half of the season, I really thought they'd put up more of a fight against Georgia. I picked them to win the game. Preseason-wise, I picked them to be the number 1 seed in the college football playoff and win the SEC. And that can still happen. One loss is probably not going to keep them out of the SEC championship game. It would be beneficial for them, obviously, if Georgia lost, because then they wouldn't have that head-to-head tiebreaker. But there are only 2 teams, Texas A&M and LSU in the SEC, who don't have a conference loss. And every team in the SEC has a loss overall. So one loss is probably not going to keep them out. They're currently 6th in the SEC standings. And a lot of the teams that are in front of them are going to play each other, and there's losses that have to happen in front of them. So, they still have an opportunity to probably if they win out, get into the SEC championship game and maybe turn things around here. But now they have a road game against a ranked Vanderbilt team with the opportunity to get back on track next week. And somehow number 25 Vanderbilt is ranked for the first time since 2013, despite having a loss to 2-4 Georgia State, and they struggled with 2-5 Ball State last Saturday. They were tied with Ball State going into the fourth quarter, and Ball State has one of the worst defenses in the country. I think they were 130th in the defensive efficiency, but very, very backdoor ranking there, but a cool moment for that program. So the Longhorns will travel to number 25 Vanderbilt on Saturday, and we'll see if Texas can get back on track there or if Vandy can potentially give them some trouble like they did to Alabama. Number 11 Tennessee took down number 7 Alabama 24-17 in a slugfest on Saturday. The Vols have now beaten the Tide in back-to-back games in Neyland and in 2 of the last 3 overall. That is, however, also 2 of the last 19 overall. Just their second win over Alabama in the last 19 years. So, this game was very similar to Georgia-Texas in it just being super ugly, pretty terrible offense for a while, good defense for a while, that type of game for the first 2.5 quarters. They got it going a little bit later in the game, but I think it was just 7-0 Alabama with 6 minutes left in the third quarter. So, there were 3 missed field goals in the first half, 3 interceptions in the first half, and it took a while for things to get going. This game was almost identical to what Tennessee did against Florida last week, and it didn't quite look like a top 11 matchup. This was the 3rd consecutive week, actually, that Tennessee has been shut out in the first half. They had 0 at halftime against Arkansas, Florida, and then Alabama. They beat Florida 23-17 last week after the Gators just refused to win that game, and then they beat Alabama 24-17 on Saturday and needed dramatic second-half comebacks for both. The Vols are back in the top 10 at number 7. They took Alabama's spot and moved up to where the Tide was last week. But the past 3 weeks for Tennessee have been really, really shaky. But they got through the last 2 games with wins, and now they get a much-needed bye week to potentially fine-tune some things on offense. Alabama is now 5-2, and they've dropped to number 15 in the latest AP Top 25. They have 2 losses before November for the first time since 2007, Nick Saban's first season there. And that's something I also wanted to talk about was the conversation around Kalen DeBoer. And are things going how they envisioned in Tuscaloosa? Obviously not. But this is almost on par with like every other Alabama coach's first year. Literally. Bear Bryant went 5-4 in his first year at Alabama. He won 5 national titles. Gene Stallings went 7-5 in his first year at Alabama. He won a national title 2 years later. Nick Saban went 7-6 in his first year at Alabama. He won 7 national titles. And then just in general, other first-year coaches at new programs, Kirby Smart, he went 8-5 at Georgia in his first year. He was in the national championship game the year after that and has since won 2 national titles. Dabo Swinney went 9-5 in his first year at Clemson. He has 2 national titles, and he's been to 4 national championship games. I was reading through a lot of stuff about DeBoer, a lot of what people were saying, a lot of quick takes, a lot of he's not cut out for the South, for the SEC. He's in over his head, all sorts of stuff like that. And yeah, things aren't what Alabama fans are used to at the moment, but their reaction is understandable, though, because for the vast majority of that, the younger portion of that fan base, they quite literally do not know a season like this. Like I said before, this is the first time that they've had 2 losses before November since 2007. So for any student there who's 18, 19, 20, I mean, they were barely alive the last time that happened and obviously weren't watching. So they quite literally don't know a season like this. But yeah, it's been a pretty interesting one, and I think there's a lot of comments being made about DeBoer that might want to be retracted later on. Number 6 Miami pulled out yet another one by 1 score, this time on the road in a 52-45 shootout with Louisville. And similar to Tennessee, the Canes have just gotten really, really lopsided lately. Tennessee's problems are all on offense for the most part. Miami's problems are on defense. And now Louisville's offense is really good, but this is 3 consecutive games for the Canes where they've allowed over 30 points. Louisville did have a kickoff return for a touchdown, so they scored 45, but technically 38 was allowed by the defense, but that's really not much better. And they definitely need to find some answers there if they're going to be competitive with the other contenders in the ACC, like Clemson and SMU and Pitt potentially in the ACC championship. Cam Ward continues to shine, though, on offense and lead this team to wins. He had 348 total yards and 4 touchdowns. And one bright spot that was big to see for Miami and who could really play a significant role for them down the stretch was Damian Martinez at running back. He really hadn't done a ton since like week 2 after having some really high preseason expectations, but he had 12 carries for 89 yards and what ended up being a game-winning touchdown where he just ran over a Louisville defender. Martinez transferred in from Oregon State, and part of him not being in the spotlight as much as expected is the fact that Miami really has 4 solid running backs. They've had a different leading rusher in 4 of the last 5 games. A.J. Allen had 104 on Ball State, Jordan Lyle had 104 also on USF, Mark Fletcher had 81 on Cal, and now Martinez had 89 on Louisville. So they've really got a stable in the backfield, and Martinez is starting to look like the big bruising type of weapon most people thought that he'd be for them. For Louisville, they are the best 3-loss team in the country. For whatever that may be worth, the 4-3 Louisville Cardinals are not the team that their record indicates. They have a 7-point loss to number 6 Miami, they have a 7-point loss to number 12 Notre Dame, and they have a 7-point loss to number 22 SMU. Those are all games that really came down to a play or two also, and unfortunately for the Cardinals, they've just had every single one go against them. Miami seems to find a way to win every close game, and for Louisville, it's just the polar opposite, where they seem to be right there in every game, but manage to come up short every time. So Louisville also still has to play number 9 Clemson and number 19 Pitt, so very, very tough schedule there, but also 2 opportunities to potentially flip the script and for them to earn a few solid wins. Number 16, Indiana just absolutely steamrolled Nebraska 56-7 on Saturday. And I think this was the week that a lot of people were waiting for with the Hoosiers. I mentioned it in the preview episode, but they faced really one of the worst schedules in the country. It was 113th heading into Saturday, and now it's 109th. But I think beating a team like Nebraska, who came into the week at 5-1, a pretty quality opponent, beating them 56-7, I think really helped Indiana turn a corner in terms of national perception. I think most college football fans saw Indiana's final scores against FIU and Western Illinois and 2-5 UCLA and Charlotte and Maryland and Northwestern, and they were like, all right, they've done pretty well, but how many other teams would also be 6-0 against that schedule? And I think a lot of people were a little bit questioning of just how good Indiana might be this season. And some might say the same thing about beating Nebraska too, like, okay, how many other teams would be 7-0 with that schedule? But beating the Cornhuskers 56-7 is undeniable domination, and a performance that we're used to seeing in a Big Ten game like that from Ohio State. And for reference, Illinois is number 20 right now. They went to overtime with Nebraska and beat them by 7, and Indiana just beat them by 49. So a little bit of a comparison there, and I think the Hoosiers earned a lot of respect. Indiana's 7-0 for the first time since 1967. They're up to number 13 in this week's AP poll. That's their highest ranking since 2020, and their highest ranking in a normal season since 1987. And coming into the season, Indiana had just a 0.6% chance to make the college football playoff. according to the ESPN FPI. That chance is now 62%. 0.6 in the preseason to now 62%. ESPN system is saying that it's more likely than not that Indiana will be in the college football playoff. On Friday night, Duke made some program history with their first ever win over Florida State. The Blue Devils were previously 0-22. 0-22 all time against the Seminoles, but they got the job done this season with a 23-16 victory. Manny Diaz has Duke at 6-1. They're already bowl eligible, and now they have a big-time opportunity hosting number 22 SMU this week to assert themselves as a potential contender in the ACC. Also on Friday night, number 13 BYU survived a major scare from Oklahoma State. The Cowboys had a 99.2% chance to win this game, according to the ESPN win probability indicator, after they took the lead with just over a minute left. But BYU put together a perfect 9-play drive that took 56 seconds and included converting on 4th and 7 on one of those plays, and they eventually scored a game-winning touchdown on a very poorly defended 35-yard reception by Darius Lassiter. Oklahoma State just continues to struggle in a couple areas, but specifically at quarterback. They had a little bit of momentum early on with Garrett Rangel in, but he ended up getting hurt and going out for the rest of the game. So Alan Bowman was brought back in. He missed his first 5 passes, but he finished 11 of 19 for 85 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. And pretty impressive, though, that their leading passer had 85 yards, and they were still in this game and had a 99.2% chance to win it with a minute left. That was largely in part due to Ollie Gordon finally putting on a show for the first time really since last season. He had 127 total yards and 3 touchdowns, but he also was in and out of the game for the entirety of it with injuries, and just a really disappointing season in that aspect for the Cowboys. They had a ton of potential coming in, but got hammered really hard with the injury bug. If you don't know, they're missing their top 3 defenders. And then, like I mentioned, their quarterback situation has been tough, and they finally had a little bit of something with Rangel, and then he goes out with an injury. Ollie Gordon was going over to the sideline pretty much after every time he got tackled, and it's just been a pretty rough season in that aspect for them. But the Cowboys are now 0-4 in Big 12 play. Very similar to BYU, number 9 Iowa State barely escaped a major challenge from UCF. The Cyclones needed a dramatic touchdown drive in the final seconds, just like the Cougars did, and the Big 12 nearly had both of their remaining undefeated teams, and the 2 teams tied for first in their conference standings go down this week, but both managed to pull off thrilling wins. Number 21 SMU dominated Stanford 40-10 on Saturday night. They had an 87-yard touchdown on the first play of the game and just didn't look back. The Mustangs are quietly ranked. They are quietly 6-1, already bowl eligible. Their only loss is by 3 to number 11 BYU. And I've touched on it before, but that's a game that they really easily could have won. They're undefeated in ACC play, and it's time for the rest of the country to start looking at them like a serious ACC and college football playoff contender. SMU's remaining schedule includes a road trip to 6-1 Duke, undefeated number 19 Pitt, a huge game there, Boston College, Virginia, and then Cal. Do you notice who's not on that schedule? Number 6 Miami or number 9 Clemson. None of those 3, Miami, Clemson, and SMU, play each other in the regular season. And I'll probably talk about this a little later in the week on social media, but there's a legitimate chance that I was looking into where the ACC could get 3 teams into the college football playoff if they were all to win out, and then Clemson beat Miami in the ACC championship. That would leave us with 12-1 Clemson with the auto bid, 12-1 Miami, and then 11-1 SMU, and all 3 of those teams would be in. So a very intriguing team to watch there for the rest of the season, and they've been very exciting to watch for the last few weeks. But not only because of the implications within the ACC race, but for other teams around the country who could end up fighting with SMU for a potential spot in the college football playoff. Florida dominated Kentucky 48-20 in the Swamp on Saturday night, and this team has looked really decent over the past few weeks. So after a rocky start to the season that was overshadowed with talk of Billy Napier getting fired basically every single day, some of us tried to point out that things really weren't as bad as most made them appear in Gainesville. In my season preview of Florida, I really dove deep into the roster and broke down a lot of why I thought they could be a solid team this season. and some of that is finally starting to be put on display. Specifically, the transfer wide receivers, Elijah Badger and Shimere Dike, they combined for 5 receptions for 215 yards on Saturday. And then 4-star freshman running back Jaden Baugh, we'll get to him in the Kings of the Week segment, but he's been phenomenal in place of an injured Montrell Johnson. DJ Lagway took over for an injured Graham Mertz, and he was pretty solid in his first start against a power conference opponent, against an FBS opponent, and he did pretty well. The Gators really should have beaten Tennessee in Neyland 2 weeks ago. They had every opportunity to win that game and just choked it, but this team is a hair from being 5-2 and probably ranked had they beaten the Vols, so something very interesting to watch in Gainesville, as they could potentially cause some major problems for Texas or Georgia or LSU or Ole Miss. They have quite the remaining schedule, but they could definitely upset one of those teams and cause a lot of chaos in the SEC race. Army and Navy just continue to steamroll conference opponents. Number 23 Army beat East Carolina 45-28, and the game wasn't even that close. ECU scored 21 in the fourth quarter to make it look a little bit better, but the Black Knights led that game 38-7 at one point. Navy just smoked Charlotte 51-17. They didn't even need to score in the fourth quarter. They were just already up by that much. And a lot of those hypotheticals about Army and Navy potentially having a college football playoff position on the line later in the season in the AAC championship, they're starting to look more and more possible each week. And the Midshipmen can make that extremely possible if they beat number 12 Notre Dame, who they face this week. All right, before we get into Kings of the Week, I quickly wanted to do a rankings reaction segment. And this is something that I'm going to be doing every week when the College Football Playoff Top 25 starts coming out on November 5th. And then I think it's the 5th, 12th, 19th, 26th, and then maybe one for Selection Sunday after that. But those are the official committee rankings, the rankings that'll decide the 12-team College Football Playoff field. And those are the ones that really matter. But in the meantime, we have the AP to kind of give some sort of structure, I guess, to the sport. But the actual CFP rankings don't come out for a couple weeks. But I did kind of want to give an introductory segment here, I guess, with rankings reaction to be able to kind of give my thoughts on where certain teams are right now. But in the latest AP Top 25, Oregon is number 1. They finally got their rightful spot there in my eyes. I made quite a deal about that last week in the Week 8 preview episode, that I thought Oregon should have been number 1 over Texas just based on resume and stuff. But they should have been there last week, but they at least got it now. That's their first appearance at number 1 since 2012. Why is Texas still in the top 5? They played 3-loss Michigan, 3-loss Oklahoma, 6-loss Mississippi State, and 3 group of 5 teams. And then got dominated at home by 2 possessions when it came time to face a team that had an offense in the top 70. And I don't necessarily have an issue with Texas being in the top 5 as much as I do with them being treated so much differently than Clemson. Clemson's done exactly the same thing that Texas has. They've both lost to Georgia by double digits, and they've both dominated everybody else. But Texas is 5 and Clemson's 9. It just doesn't make any sense. And I put out a kind of side-by-side comparison of this on Twitter. I put Clemson had one bad half against Georgia. They were outscored 28-3 in the second half of that Week 1 game on the road in Atlanta. Since then, they've beaten App State by 46, NC State by 24, Stanford by 26, Florida State by 16, Wake Forest by 35, and Virginia by 17. Texas has done basically the same thing. They had one bad half against Georgia. They were outscored 23-0 in the first half at home. And the difference is they had 6 weeks of film on Georgia to prepare with. Clemson was coming into the season with not much. But then Texas beat Colorado State by 52. They beat Michigan by 19. They beat UTSA by 49. They beat UL Monroe by 48. Mississippi State by 22. And Oklahoma by 31. So another thing was that Texas's ranking for basically the entire season has been based around this illusion that Michigan is good, which they aren't, because they were top 10, they were number 10 when Texas beat them in week 2. They are now 4-3 and easily, like I mentioned before, could have like 1 or 2 wins if they didn't have the onside kick called back against Minnesota and the 4th down touchdown against USC. I mean, this could quite literally be a 2-win team in Michigan. And they were number 10 when Texas beat them, though, and there's just kind of been this illusion around Michigan that was some sort of massive win for Texas, which is just not true. So the only problem I have there is, why is Texas 5 and Clemson's 9? They've done the exact same thing. Miami continues to be underrated week after week. They have close games with teams like Virginia Tech and Cal and Louisville, and they get punished for it, and then everybody calls them overrated and, treats them like that. But Penn State has a close game with Bowling Green. They beat Bowling Green by 6, and they got taken into overtime by 4-loss USC, and nobody cares. Penn State's number 3. Miami's number 6. So another kind of discrepancy there in inconsistent treatment of teams. Texas plays the exact same thing that Clemson has, and they're number 5, and Clemson's number 9. Penn State's had close calls with a group of 5 team. At least Miami's close calls have been with conference opponents. And Penn State's undefeated. They get to be number 3. Miami's undefeated. They're punished at number 6. Just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense there. I mentioned it earlier, but Indiana earned a lot of respect. They moved up to number 13 in this week's poll. And I think people are finally starting to come around to treating Indiana like, okay, this team's actually really good. Like I said earlier, it was kind of still up for debate. It was like, well, they beat FIU and Western Illinois and Charlotte and Northwestern. It was just not a very impressive resume, but beating a 5-1 team 56-7, a lot of AP voters and just a lot of people around the country in general are really starting to respect Indiana a lot more. Alabama at number 15 is insane to see, and one could argue that they should even be lower with 2 losses, but I mentioned it earlier with Alabama's fan base responding in crazy ways, because this is quite literally the first time that a lot of them have seen Alabama play like this. And I'm actually a part of that. This is the first time that I can remember Alabama being number 15 ever. I remember them briefly being number 13 in 2015 after they lost to Ole Miss, and I think they dropped to 12 at one point in the CFP rankings after they lost to Auburn in 2019. But if you can't tell, I'm relatively young, but I actually don't remember Alabama being number 15 ever. So it's pretty cool to see a massive shakeup in a lot of the rankings, and just something interesting to see there with the Tide. Missouri should not be ranked, and I've been pretty vocal about that on Twitter lately, but if Missouri's ranked, Syracuse should be ranked like 3 or 4 spots higher than them. If Missouri's ranked, Duke should be ranked. If Missouri's ranked, probably UNLV should be ranked. I mean, the Tigers just don't have the resume to be number 21 right now, and they especially don't have the resume to be ahead of SMU. And really, I mean, they've kind of done the same thing as Army and Navy, except those teams haven't lost. They've played really bad strength of schedules, but they've looked impressive against them. Missouri struggled with Boston College, who I think has 3 losses. They struggled with Vanderbilt, who is ranked now at number 25, but that still wasn't an impressive game. They struggled with 2-loss Auburn. They had their quarterback go out for a little bit. They got murdered by Texas A&M. They just really have not looked like a ranked team, and especially one to be ahead of SMU, whose only loss is by 3 to BYU, and they've steamrolled through a lot of their other opponents. So there's a lot of conference patch carrying going on there for Missouri. But if they earn a win over Alabama this week, that would prop up their resume a little bit. But as we've seen with Alabama, they're not quite what we've been accustomed to seeing in Tuscaloosa lately. So there's just not enough for Missouri to be number 21 right now. And if they beat Alabama, that'll take care of itself. They'll earn some respect that way. But for now, Missouri should not be ranked. And lastly, Vanderbilt's ranked number 25. I mentioned it earlier as well, but I'm happy to see Vanderbilt there, because it's just a program that people kind of really feel bad for in what they've gone through over the last decade or so. But ranked for the first time since 2013, they really did kind of backdoor their way into that ranking by default. But it is cool to see them there. They lost to 2-4 Georgia State. They almost lost to 2-5 Ball State. There's no other team would be ranked with that type of resume, but they do have the win over Alabama at least, so they have something on the resume there. But very interesting to see Vanderbilt ranked for the first time in over a decade. So that's about it for the ranking segment. Just going to be picking a few teams each week that I disagree with the ranking of, whether they should be higher or lower than they are. Comparing certain teams' resumes, comparing what teams have done, all sorts of stuff like that. But I'll start doing that when the college football playoff rankings come out on November 5th. and those come out on Tuesday nights, so those will be in the Thursday episode, the preview episode for each week. But yeah, we'll finally get some rankings that give us a real accurate depiction of who's in the running for this new expanded college football playoff. But yeah, looking forward to it. Let me know in the comments what you think about the segment. If you agree with me or if you disagree, just let me know your thoughts down below. All right, it's time now for Kings of the Week, a segment where I highlight some of the best performances across college football each and every week. Jaden Baugh at Florida was an absolute beast on Saturday night. He's a true freshman. He was a 4-star in the class of 2024. And in place of Montrell Johnson against Kentucky, in his first career start, Baugh put up 22 carries for 106 yards and 5 touchdowns against a Wildcats defense that had been really impressive so far this year. Kentucky held Georgia to 13, they held Ole Miss to 17, and they had really just been a stifling defense for most of the year, and Baugh and the Gators just lit them up. For the first time this season, we have a kicker making an appearance in Kings of the Week. Michigan State's Jonathan Kim just totally carried the Spartans to a 32-20 victory over Iowa. He made 6 field goals in this game, and they had him attempt 7. 6 for 7 on field goals and then 2 for 2 on extra points. Kim was responsible for 20 of Michigan State's 32 points. He had as many points himself as Iowa did in this game. His 6 made field goals are the most in a game in Michigan State program history. Bashal Tootin at Virginia Tech had a wild game on Thursday night. Against Boston College, Tootin had 18 carries for 266 yards and 3 touchdowns. And then for good measure, he also had a reception for 20 yards and a touchdown as well. 286 total yards, 4 total touchdowns. The Hokies won 42-21, and Virginia Tech's starting to look like a pretty solid team. That's going to wrap up this episode of the show. Really appreciate you making it all the way to the end. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed and subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, or follow if you're listening on Spotify. And definitely make sure to follow at CFBKings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.